Lilith. Now there's a name that really does stir the imagination, doesn't it? Often depicted as little more than a demon in the later texts, this figure was once considered Adam's first wife, formed not from his rib, but alongside him from the very earth itself. A companion not born of man, but of the same raw material, equal, independent, and with a mind and spirit all her own. Quite the contrast to poor Eve, the second creation who was fashioned from Adam's side, destined to be his helper, his subordinate. But let's not rush ahead, my dear friends. Let us rewind the clock just a tad. Before we do, however, welcome to the Temple of Gods. Now, I trust you've all subscribed, liked, and hit that little bell, for you won't want to miss any of our delightful wanderings through the mysteries of the ancient world. Now, as I was saying, let's travel back in time. You see, the tale of Adam and Eve, while now deeply embedded in Hebrew tradition, doesn't exist in a vacuum. Far from it, in fact. It draws from much older myths, stretching back to the great civilizations of Sumer and Babylonia. In the ancient Sumerian myths, much like in the Hebrew Bible, the stories of creation are deeply intertwined. In Sumer, figures like Yabani and Ukhat were created from the same earth, much like Adam and Lilith were in the Hebrew tradition. Ebani and Ukhat, much like Adam and Lilith, were born of the earth together, establishing an inherent equality between them. But here's where it gets especially interesting. The parallels continue when we look at Enki and Ninhursag in Sumerian mythology. Enki, the god, and Ninhursag, the goddess, share a divine creation story with Adam and Eve. Much like Ninhursag, who was created from the rib of Enki, Eve was made from Adam's rib. In both cases, this divine creation from the rib signifies a connection, yet one that positions the woman in a secondary role. One of partnership, yes, but also in Eve's case, one of hierarchy. A striking shift, don't you think? Now back to Lilith. Her creation from the earth was symbolic of something much more profound. She wasn't meant to be subordinate, but equal. This idea intrigued some, yet unsettled the patriarchal structures which would later dominate religious narratives. But Lilith, bless her, saw no reason to submit to Adam's authority. In many interpretations, she flatly rejected his claim to superiority, and her departure from Eden was not one of sin, but of independence, a refusal to be tamed. Quite the remarkable act of defiance, wouldn't you agree? Lilith, once an independent figure of freedom and autonomy, gradually became demonized in later texts. Her transformation began long before she was associated with witches and hags. In ancient Sumerian and Akkadian texts, she was known as Lilach, a spirit associated with death and darkness, a figure to be feared, especially by men and mothers of infants. But wait, there's more. Lilith was cursed, turned into the screech owl, a symbol of night, death and mystery, a bird of omen, as it were. She became the very embodiment of chaos itself. In Jewish mysticism, particularly in the Zohar, she's blamed for the ruin of the world, forever entwined in the malevolent forces of the night. But here's the twist. Lilith's connection to the owl, a creature steeped in symbolism, is often linked to goddesses like Inanna and Ishtar, offering us a window into the dual nature of her existence. These goddesses too were associated with fertility, death and the underworld. So, in a curious turn, Lilith, as the owl, becomes both a harbinger of death and a potent reminder of untapped, unspoken female power. Now, some scholars have drawn fascinating parallels between Lilith and the figure of Sophia, or divine wisdom. In certain traditions, wisdom is depicted as a feminine force who co-created the world alongside God, a concept that later became absorbed into Christian theology as the Holy Spirit. If we stretch our imaginations a little further, might Lilith represent that same spirit? Misunderstood, demonized, yet no less vital to the world's existence? And then, of course, there's Eve, the second woman in Genesis. Her story has become the most famous, the most scrutinized, and indeed the most debated. Created from Adam's rib, Eve's very origin is often interpreted as reinforcing her subordinate role. She was made not from the earth like Lilith, but from Adam, suggesting dependence, or so the interpretation goes. Eve's actions in the Garden of Eden, when she ate the forbidden fruit and led Adam to sin, have long been blamed for the fall of humanity. This narrative in turn cast her as the source of original sin and used it to justify the oppression of women for centuries. But hold your horses. Eve too was a figure of rebellion in her own right. Her decision to partake of the forbidden fruit was an act of defiance, a thirst for knowledge and empowerment that transcended the divine command. In her own way, Eve challenged the idea that women were meant to be passive and obedient. She may have fallen, but in doing so, she reached for something beyond the role assigned to her. Whether you see her as the original sinner or the one who brought knowledge into the world, Eve's role is intrinsically tied to the establishment of gendered power structures. Both Lilith and Eve stand as early figures in a long, tangled history of women defying their roles in society, challenging the constraints placed upon them by patriarchal systems. Yet their voices, once strong, were gradually overshadowed by centuries of theological and cultural forces that cemented the idea of women as subordinate. But in their original forms, these figures might have represented something far more complex and subversive. The Hebrew word Adam doesn't simply mean man, as we often assume. No, it's derived from Adama, meaning earth or ground. Fascinating, isn't it? This suggests that Adam wasn't necessarily male in the way we understand it, but rather a representation of humanity as a whole, created from the very earth itself. This idea, not so far removed from the Sumerian myth of the first human, created from the earth and made both male and female, calls into question the traditional interpretations of gender in the creation story. So what are we to make of all this, my dear friends? Lilith and Eve, both defiant in their own ways, stand as early figures in the long history of women challenging their roles. Their stories, twisted and suppressed over time, offer us glimpses of an alternative narrative, one where women were not subordinate, but co-creators of the world around them. The path of power, freedom, and complexity runs through their stories, challenging our very understanding of creation itself. Quite the journey, wouldn't you say?